Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here, and I'm here to complete my brief series on the biblical meaning and understanding of Jesus' crucifixion. Last time I presented the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus within the context of the largest story that is told by the Old Testament and that the New Testament authors think is fulfilled through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And just to recap, that larger story begins with the story of the human vocation, where God creates the universe as God's temple, and human beings are created as living images of God's presence in the world. And our fundamental vocation is to worship God and to extend God's wise and loving presence out to others. Unfortunately, as we know, this story becomes a tragedy, and that is the story of human beings worshiping creatures rather than the Creator and giving over our power to these creatures, these idols, and they in turn enslaving us. And this kind of sub-story of the human vocation leads into the story of Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Israel. Because God begins again to try to turn the human race back to its fundamental vocation through Abraham and Moses and Israel. The vocation of Israel is to be the light of the world and to turn all of humanity back to God. But it too fails in this vocation. Israel is like the lifeguard coming out in the rowboat to help the drowning swimmer, and then the lifeguard falling into the water and drowning as well. And that's how Israel's story in some ways ends. But you do get another set of stories told by the great prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And these prophets tell a story of hope. And it is the hope that the Creator will launch a new creation. It's the story of the God of the Exodus launching a new Exodus in which God will one day return to dwell in Jerusalem and eventually rule as king over all of creation. And part of that story is the story that God will forgive Israel, restore the covenant, pour God's Spirit into Israel's heart. And with Israel renewed, then they can turn to the renewal of all of humanity and ultimately of all of creation. Now there's a late set of stories I mentioned last time that you hear in the book of Daniel and others. And that's the story of suffering, where somehow suffering will be involved in bringing about God's new world and God's new creation. Not that they think that the Messiah will suffer. There is no concept of a Messiah suffering in the Old Testament. But they believe somehow suffering will be involved in God's new world coming to be. Now these stories all converge on the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Let me just give you a feel for this. The Gospels all begin with the story of Jesus as the story of God returning to dwell in Israel, although not in the temple, but in Jesus. For instance, Mark's Gospel begins with the voice of one crying out in the desert, "Prepare the way of the Lord," and John the Baptist shows up. Well, that is a quote from Isaiah 40, in which Yahweh is envisioned as returning Israel from exile back to the Holy Land. Well, Mark applies this to Jesus, because in Jesus, when Jesus shows up, he is God returning, and therefore launching the new return from exile. In Matthew's Gospel, we hear Gabriel telling us that Jesus is God with us. That's another way in which the hope that God would return is expressed in the person and ministry of Jesus. And of course in John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in verse 13, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So you get throughout the Gospels the story of Jesus as the fulfillment of this hope that God would return. You also get the story of Jesus told as the story of the gathering of scattered Israel. As Jesus gathers a community around him and calls the 12, as he begins to heal and forgive and free people, Jesus is embodying the hope of Israel, the hope that God will finally gather the people of Israel and heal them, restore them, renew the vocation that they fundamentally have. Now, in the midst of the telling of these two stories, you get the story of Jesus announcing and making real in people's lives the coming of God's kingdom. That's just another way of telling the story of God returning to dwell in Israel and become king of the world. But underneath that story is a story of hostility towards Jesus. And it's the story of hostility coming from his neighbors, from his fellow Jews, particularly the Pharisees, from the Jewish leadership, but also from the Romans. And underneath that is the story of hostility from the forces of evil. Because the kingdom of God that Jesus is announcing and making real involves the overthrowing of all the powers and forces that have enslaved us through idolatry. And all of these stories, but especially this story of hostility and Jesus' conflict with these forces, converges on the cross. Now, this is where the story of Jesus' crucifixion gets strange. Because the Gospels tell the story of Jesus as the powerful one. In the desert, he confronts the devil and defeats him. When Jesus is healing people, when he is exorcising demons, he is defeating the devil and his demons. And so the Gospels are told as the story of Jesus who speaks and acts with power. The power goes out of him. Here's, though, where the Gospels become strange. Because all four Gospels end by telling the story of Jesus as the one who is weak and abandoned and powerless and vulnerable and ultimately dead. So it's a very strange ending. It starts out with Jesus, very powerful, taking on and defeating the forces of evil, and it ends with Jesus as powerless. And it seems that on Good Friday, once again, the forces of evil have won. That Jesus has been crushed by the very forces that he came to defeat. But we know that is not the end of the story. St. Paul has this wonderful line in 1 Corinthians where he says, if the powers of this world knew, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Because on the day that Jesus was crucified, the powers and principalities, the idols of this world, lost their power. In fact, it's on that day that Jesus nails them to the cross, and they finally are defeated. Paul starts out his letter to the Corinthians this way. He says, I proclaim Christ crucified, the power of God. Paul thinks that a strange, new kind of power is at work on the cross. Not military power, not the power of coercion and domination, but the power of God's liberating love. You see, on the cross, Jesus exposes to the world what the powers and what the forces of evil get us to do to each other. And the last thing evil wants, the last thing the powers want, is to be exposed to the light, to be shown that they are the ones behind all the terrible things we do to each other. You see, on the cross, life itself, truth and justice itself, divine love itself enters into the darkness of our world and into these dark forces that enslave us, to free us from them and to free the world from them. The day of Jesus' crucifixion is the day a new world dawns, where we are freed from all these powers and principalities. Now please understand, this means then that just as Jesus entered into the dark forces of hate and evil and death and the demonic itself, he continues to enter into those dark forces in our lives. So I encourage you, invite the freeing love of Christ's cross into your life. Invite the freedom of Christ's cross into those places of pain and loss, those places where you've been hurt, and those places where you hurt other people. Allow the freedom of Christ's cross to come into all of your relationships and all of your situations, so that you can be freed and transformed. Because here's the real good news. Christ's cross frees us from the forces that enslave us in our world, so that we no longer have to live for them, but we can live for Christ. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that we now are free to live for Christ. And when we live for him, we flourish. We become fully alive. When we have relationships and communities that live for Christ rather than from these enslaving forces, new things happen. New relationships, new systems, new institutions can emerge that are in the service of Christ. Listen to what Paul says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. For the love of Christ impels us. Once we have come to the conviction that one died for all, therefore all have died. He indeed died for all, so that those who might live, here it is, no longer live for themselves, but live for his sake. Consequently, from now on, we no longer regard anyone according to the flesh. Even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him so no longer. So whoever is in Christ is a new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. So let me pull this together for you. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus means that God has acted through Christ to fulfill the long-standing hopes of Israel, and the world has been changed forever. The cross is the strange way through which God defeats the very forces that enslave us and cause us to live dehumanized lives. The cross is the event of our freedom. On the cross, we are reconciled to God and to each other. And through the cross, Christ is creating a new kind of covenant community that lives no longer from hate and death, but lives for Christ. On the cross, God's new creation has begun to dawn. And we are called now to implement this in all we do. Now, I want to share with you 3 books that have been very influential in my thinking as I produced this series. The first one is by N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. It's called The Day the Revolution Began. It is perhaps the best book on the New Testament meaning of the crucifixion. And Wright goes into confusion and distorted thinking about the cross. And then he gives you the biblical background, the Old Testament background to it. And then he takes you through what the cross means in the Gospels and in Paul. So this is worth reading. I think this is the 3rd time I've read this book. Another book that focuses on the theology of the cross is Saved from Sacrifice by Mark Heim. And this book is a theological study of the cross from the point of view of René Girard's work on the scapegoat mechanism. Again, a very provocative, insightful book. And then finally, I want to mention Elizabeth Johnson's new book called Creation and the Cross. Elizabeth Johnson is a professor up at Fordham University, recently retired. She starts by looking at Anselm's satisfaction theory and critiques that, and then turns to a beautiful recovery of the theology of God in the book of the prophet Isaiah, and then takes us through Jesus' ministry, his death, his resurrection, the multiple images for understanding the cross that are found in the New Testament, and then puts this all into conversation with the current ecological crisis. So I highly recommend all three of those books for your own reading and thought. I hope this series has been helpful for you. See you in the next video.